Hey seniors, today we're going to continue with square roots. So I want you to go ahead on your notes page and draw a line down the left-hand side and go ahead and write estimating square roots. Yesterday we talked about perfect squares and finding the two integers that numbers that are not perfect squares fall between. But today we need to get a little bit more specific. So let's go ahead and talk about when you would estimate square roots. Well, if I'm given the problem the square root of 25, and I need to find out what that number is, I don't need to estimate. I already know that that equals 5, because that number is a perfect square. But if I was given a number that's not a perfect square, let's say the square root of 17, I don't know what that number is. So I have to estimate to figure out what it is. And these are our steps. Don't write any of this down yet. Wait for me to tell you what to write down. Our first step is to find the two perfect squares that your number is between. You should remember this step from yesterday, so I just want you to write down, find two perfect squares, and the number 1. The second step is to decide which integer the square root is closer to by finding the distance from each perfect square. From this, I just want you to write down the number 2 and decide which integer the square root is closer to. And this part, I do want you to write down. If it's closer to your lower number, it'll be between 0.1 and 0.4 for its decimal. If it's halfway, it'll be 0.5. If it's closer to the higher integer, it'll be between 0.6 and 0.9. This will all make sense once we start doing examples. I then want you to estimate that number to the nearest tenth and check the work by squaring your estimate. All right, so make sure that you have estimate to the nearest tenth on your notes page. Let's go ahead and do an example. This will make a little bit more sense. If I want to know what the square root of 10 is, the first thing I look for is what are the perfect squares that are around 10? So I'm thinking back to myself from yesterday, and I know that 9 is a perfect square, and 16 is a perfect square. And of course I know that the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 10 is going to fall between 3 and 4. So my next step is to figure out which one of these numbers is the square root of 10 closer to. Well, this step is pretty easy. Let's go back to our numbers. 9 is a lot closer to 10 than 10 is to 16. So I'm thinking to myself that the square root of 10 is going to be closer to 3. And since it's closer to the lower number, I know that it's going to have a decimal of 0.1 to 0.4. So let's just pick one of those numbers and square it and see if we're right. So let's pick 3.2. Again, if we square it, we multiply it by itself. And you remember from math intervention, of course, that you ignore the decimals until the end. My pen is your pen. Make sure that you're paying attention to our multiplication steps and not making errors here, because these are silly errors. 2 times 2 is 4. 2 times 3 is 6. 0 placeholder. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 3 is 9. And then, of course, I'm just adding these. 4 plus 0 is 4. 6 plus 6 is 12. 9 plus 1 is 10. I go back to my decimal. I see that 2 numbers are behind decimals, and that's what I need to have in my answer. So I know that 3.2 squared equals 10.24. And that is pretty darn close to 10. So that is a good estimate for us to accept. You could multiply other numbers, 3.1, 3.3, by themselves, and you'll get numbers that are also close to 10, but this one is pretty close, so this is the one we're going to go with. Let's do another example. If I want to know what the square root of 60 is closest to, I go through the same steps. And this one is a multiple choice problem, so we'll be able to eliminate choices almost immediately. My first step, find the perfect squares that are around that. I know that 49 is a perfect square, and that 64 is also a perfect square. And so I know the square root of 49 is 7. The square root of 64 is 8. So I know that the square root of 60 is going to fall somewhere between 7 and 8. So my next step is to figure out which one of these numbers is this number going to be closer to. Well, I go back to my choices here. 49 is pretty far away from 60, but 64 is a lot closer. So I'm thinking that the square root of 60 is going to be closer to 8. If it's going to be closer to 8, then I know that its decimal is going to be between 0.6 and 0.9. So I can go ahead and immediately eliminate 7.0 and 7.2. Those will not be our choices. So my next step is simply to square both of these numbers and figure out which one of those is closest to 60. So let's do that. Let's just pick one. We'll do 7.7. And again, if I square it, I'm multiplying it by itself. My pen is your pen. 7 times 7 is 49. 7 times 7 is 49, plus 4 is 53. 0 placeholder. 7 times 7 is 49. 7 times 7 plus 4 is 53. So the number I'm coming out with, 9 plus 0 is 9. 9 plus 3 is 12. 5 plus 3 plus 1 is 9. So the number I'm coming out with is 59.29. That is pretty darn close to 60. And again, that was 7 times 7 squared. Let's go ahead and see about 7.9. All right, I'm actually not going to take the time to multiply this out. You can do that on your own. The number you should get is 62.41. And now my last step is to figure out, is 7.7 closer or 7.9? 59.29 is closer to the number 60 than 62.41. Again, think of it in terms of money. So I can go ahead and say that 7.7 is our best guess for the square root of 60. Let's do one last example. All right, so sometimes, and you're going to see questions like this on your benchmark, you just need to figure out where on the number line the square root falls. And we did some of this yesterday. Which point on the number line is closest to the square root of 17? This one, you don't need to write anything down, you just need to be with me. I have a number line here of numbers between 4 and 8. And I need to figure out which one of these letters represents the number for the square root of 17. So again, I go through the same steps. If I want to know the square root of 17, I think, what are the perfect squares around it? So the first one that I know, I go back to my handy list. I know that the square root of 16 is a perfect square, and the square root of 25 is a perfect square. The square root of 16 is 4, and the square root of 25 is 5. So I know that the square root of 17 is going to fall between 4 and 5. So I'm looking for a letter on this number line that is between 4 and 5. And of course I see it immediately, N. So my best choice here is point N, or A. All right, I'm going to stop talking. It's time for you guys to practice.